I'm Genevieve LeMoine. I'm the curator and registrar of the Peary-MacMillan Arctic Museum here at Bowdoin, and I'll be the moderator for today's program, Challenges and Choices, Rapid Change in the Arctic, which is part of the 2020-2021 Reunion Talk Series. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. Closed captioning is available through your Zoom settings, which you'll find typically down at the bottom of your screen. This live broadcast is being recorded and will be posted when it's ready over the next week or so to Alumni Relations and the Reunion pages. So you should be able to find it there and direct people who couldn't be here to it. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. The speakers will speak one after another, and we'll save all the questions for the end. But please submit your questions at any time through the Zoom's Q&A function. Again, that's down at the bottom of your screen, and I will be monitoring that. And then when the speakers are done, we'll go to the questions. Today's session will explore the social and environmental challenges and choices in the contemporary Arctic. And we've got three very excellent panelists here to talk about that. I will briefly introduce them and then I'll hand it over to them. First, we'll hear from Andrew Hartsig, who's Bowdoin class of 1995 with a degree in anthropology and environmental studies. He went on then to study law at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law and clerked for the Honorable Michael Murphy on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. Now he lives and works in Anchorage, Alaska, where he is director of the Arctic program for the Ocean Conservancy, which is a nonprofit marine conservation organization, where he works on developing and implementing durable policy solutions in the United States Arctic, with a particular focus on offshore oil and gas and vessel traffic, which are key issues there these days. Our next speaker will be Susan Kaplan, professor of anthropology and director of the Peary-MacMillan Arctic Museum and Arctic Studies Center at Bowdoin. Susan is an Arctic anthropologist and archaeologist. She studies prehistoric and historic Inuit cultures and the history of Arctic exploration. She's particularly interested in Inuit responses to environmental change and contact with Western cultures. She's conducted fieldwork in Nunatsiavut, which is Northern Labrador, Canada, for over 35 years, and archaeological, archival, and museological projects have also taken her to Alaska, to Northern Ellesmere Island in the Canadian High Arctic, and to Newfoundland. Finally, we'll hear from Laura Henry, who's a professor of government here at Bowdoin, where she teaches courses on contemporary Russian politics and European politics, including the European Union, as well as environmental politics, climate politics, and social movements. Laura's research investigates Russia's post-Soviet transformation and state-society relations across the former Soviet Union, in addition to environmental politics. She's currently finishing a book that compares participation by Russia, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa in global governance initiatives on issues ranging from climate to HIV/AIDS. So Andrew will start us off, and I will now turn things over to him.
Great, thank you so much. And I've got some slides to share, so I'm going to just bring those up real quickly and we will get started. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to speak, and special thanks to Sarah Finney for organizing behind the scenes. She's done a phenomenal job. I'm speaking with you today from my home in Anchorage, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina people. And I'm going to start with a quick overview of the Arctic, including its geography, its people, and its wildlife. And then I'll talk about climate change and how it's affecting the region. And then finally finish up with a quick summary of some of the key marine conservation issues that we're working on at Ocean Conservancy. And when it comes to specific examples, I will focus mostly on Alaska, but you'll hear about issues in the Canadian and Russian Arctic from Professors Kaplan and Henry. So here's a polar view of the Northern Hemisphere. You see Greenland at 3 o'clock, Canada at 6 o'clock, and so on. So I just wanted to kind of orient everyone. The Arctic Ocean is surrounded by 8 Arctic nations, including the US because of Alaska. And I wanted to point out that the whole region is interconnected and that challenges don't necessarily respect national boundaries. And then lastly, I just wanted to point out the Bering Strait region where Alaska comes closest to Russia. I'll be talking about that a little bit later, so just keep that in mind. Just talking about countries does not tell the whole story of the Arctic. The Arctic is home to a rich array of indigenous cultures, and you can get a taste of that with this map of all the indigenous languages. And there's a lot of diversity even within groups that share a common language. In Alaska alone, there are nearly 230 federally recognized tribes. And indigenous peoples have adapted and continue to adapt to enormous challenges and changes over time, including colonialism and climate change. And I wanted to share this slide to give you a sense of what some of the Alaskan Arctic communities are like. It's hard to overstate how remote these places are in Western and Arctic Alaska. They're accessible only by a boat or plane or snow machine. And things like fuel and groceries and building supplies all need to be shipped in or flown in. Uktiagvik, which used to be called Barrow, that's on the upper portion of the slide. That's a hub community. It's the biggest community on Alaska's North Slope. And then below is Kivalina. It's more typical of a small coastal village, although there's really no such thing as a typical village. Traditional cultures in the Arctic are predicated on the availability of local food resources from the oceans and from the rivers and from the lands. In Alaska, the term of art for that is subsistence, and subsistence foods include things like fish, marine mammals, caribou, berries, and things like that. And to this day, subsistence foods are absolutely critical to food security. In addition, harvesting and food preparation are central to their culture, and they provide raw materials for things like traditional crafts, things like fur and ivory. At the same time, Arctic peoples are also fully engaged in the modern economy. They have jobs, they buy gas for their cars and boats and ATVs and snow machines. They're on the internet and social media. And my focus on people of the Arctic is not an accident. These folks are experts on their region, and their observations are vital to our understanding of change. And from a conservation perspective, partnering with indigenous communities is critical. The places where we work are actually their homes, and they're going to be there long after Ocean Conservancy and groups like mine have gone. So creating durable conservation solutions requires that indigenous people are part of, or ideally leading, the work. So beyond the people, the Arctic is also home to an incredible diversity of wildlife. That includes iconic species like polar bears and narwhals and walruses. The seal in the upper right is a ribbon seal, one of a handful of ice-dependent seals in the region. Other important species include bowhead and beluga whales that I haven't pictured here. And then the Arctic also provides habitat for bird species that come from all over the world. The Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands host enormous colonies of seabirds like the parakeet auklets that are at the bottom left. And then Arctic terns, pictured above the auklets, they fly back and forth from the Antarctic to the Arctic and have one of the longest migrations of any bird. And then lower down on the food web, you have species that aren't quite as charismatic, but they're hugely important to the functioning of the ecosystem. And that includes forage fish like Arctic cod, as well as these delicate little swimming sea snails. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about climate change, there's absolutely no doubt that the Arctic environment is changing rapidly. NASA scientists have concluded that it's warming about 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet. And this chart just shows the average extent of sea ice in September, which is when it reaches its lowest point each year. And beyond the loss in the extent of sea ice, the ice is also thinner and younger, all of which makes it less durable and more vulnerable. So the prospect of an ice-free Arctic in the summertime is no longer a distant possibility. It's something that we're likely to see as soon as the next couple of decades. And without ice to buffer the coast from big fall storms, coastal erosion has become a major, major problem. In Alaska, entire villages have had to relocate. Old patterns no longer hold under the new conditions, so people are literally falling through the ice in places that normally would have been safe. Hunting and travel are less predictable and more dangerous, and impacts to food security are a big issue as well. So my apologies for this slide. I know it's no fun to look at dead puffins, but this is what's happening. In recent years, we've seen massive seabird die-offs, unexplained mortality events for whales, huge changes to fish stocks, and more. The climate is restructuring marine ecosystems in ways that we've just never before experienced. And on top of everything else, diminishing sea ice and other changes make it easier to expand industrial and commercial activities in the Arctic. And unless these things are really carefully managed, they can create even more risk. And that leads me to the last few slides that just touch on some of the main marine conservation issues affecting the Arctic, starting with commercial fishing. The Bering Sea has rich commercial fisheries. This is where we get the pollock that's in fish sticks and filet of fish sandwiches. This is where the Deadliest Catch TV show takes place. The fisheries up here are relatively well managed compared to a lot of other places. At the same time, they face enormous challenges from climate change as fish stocks move in response to warming waters. And just as an example, recently in the North Pacific, fishery managers had to close a cod fishery in the Gulf of Alaska, most likely because of climate change. So commercial fishermen haven't yet ventured into the Arctic Ocean north of the Bering Strait, but there are real concerns about what would happen if they did, especially since the area for a long time just was not regulated at all. And about a dozen years ago, conservation groups and scientists managed to convince US fishery managers to take a precautionary approach that won't allow commercial fishing in the US Arctic Ocean unless and until the science shows that the ecosystem can support it. And that approach was then adopted by Canada in a portion of its Arctic waters. And now it's being implemented by an international agreement in the high seas of the Central Arctic Ocean. So that's a success story. And then you have marine debris. Like a lot of other places around the world, Arctic waters are seeing an increase in marine debris. Just because it's remote doesn't mean the Arctic escapes this problem. This photo is from the Pribilof Islands, which are in the middle of the Bering Sea, hundreds of miles from anywhere, literally. And there's tons of trash on the beaches, literally tons. Further north in the Bering Strait region, there was a big pulse of marine debris last year that caused a lot of concern. You also have microplastics that are found almost everywhere, including in the Arctic. So plastic debris affects both people and wildlife, and there's no silver bullet, but at least people are beginning to be more aware of the issue. When I first came to Ocean Conservancy in 2008, I spent most of my time working to stop or at least reduce the risk of proposed offshore oil and gas operations in the US Arctic Ocean. Oil and gas companies at that time viewed the Arctic as a huge untapped resource, and the decline in sea ice made the region even more accessible, and there was a huge push to drill that was led by Shell Oil. And I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that Shell really fumbled the ball there. During its 2012 drilling season, both its drill ships ended up running aground, and they were unable to complete a test well. And then when they tried again in 2015, they did finally manage to drill one well, but it came up dry. And after that, Shell pulled out of the offshore Arctic. And after they gave up, most other companies in the Arctic did as well. So now offshore drilling in the Arctic is unlikely, in the US Arctic, I should say, is unlikely to make a comeback, at least in the near term. That said, there's still a lot of drilling activity onshore in Alaska. That's still active and expanding into new areas. And the push to drill in new and fragile places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which you see here on the far right, that's hugely controversial. And that's especially true when you consider that oil and gas revenues provide a really important source of money for the state of Alaska and for indigenous communities on the North Slope. So the question going forward is, how do we transition to renewable energy sources in a way that's just and equitable? And then I wanted to talk about vessel traffic. Much like offshore oil and gas, the decline in sea ice, along with new technologies and new opportunities, has led to a growth in vessel traffic. Routes that were not viable in the past now are, and that includes the Northern Sea Route that runs across the top of Russia, as well as the Northwest Passage that weaves among the islands north of Canada. And then at some point in the not too distant future, a route that runs right across the top over the North Pole, the polar route, will probably be an option as well. And risks from vessel traffic include potential oil spills, pollution from emissions, discharge of waste into water, ship strikes on slow-moving marine mammals, and then introduction of invasive species, among other things. And because of the general policy of freedom of navigation, it's not practical to try and just turn off this flow of vessel traffic, but it can be managed and risks can be reduced. We've had a lot of success getting effective management measures in place, starting with the Aleutian Islands down at the bottom of your screen in 2016, moving up to the Bering Strait region in 2018. And now the Coast Guard is looking at the region just north of Alaska. And we're looking ahead to management measures for the Central Arctic Ocean in the future. And this vessel traffic ranges from tugs and barges and landing craft that supply local communities to ships that support onshore mining and oil and gas operations, to cruise ships, to research vessels, and even cargo shipping traffic. In fact, Russia used the recent incident of the Ever Given getting stuck in the Suez Canal to promote its Northern Sea Route as an alternative. So with all this variety of vessel traffic, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. But it's important to think through all of the possibilities to reduce risks and increase safety and minimize user conflicts, especially between small skiffs that are used by subsistence hunters and then big, large commercial craft. And I wanted to end with just an example of where I think conservation in the US Arctic is headed. This is a map of the Northern Bering Sea Climate Resilience Area. This is an entirely new sort of designation. It was created by President Obama in 2016, then abolished by President Trump, and then just recently reinstated by President Biden. And this special designation is meant to address the whole suite of concerns that I just talked about, the overarching concern of climate change, plus industrial and commercial threats like oil and gas and bottom trawling, which is a kind of fishing, and impacts from vessel traffic. And more than that, it recognizes that the Bering Strait is home to indigenous Alaska Native peoples and attempts to give them a much, much stronger say in the management of the region. So this is brand new. Nobody really knows how it will turn out, but I think this attempt to integrate conservation with indigenous management represents a promising new direction and could be a sign of things to come for the US Arctic. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Kaplan, who will take a closer look at some of the issues in the Canadian Arctic.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. So, hello, everybody, and thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful overview. Speaking to you from my office on the second floor of Hubbard Hall overlooking the quad. And I want to acknowledge that Bowdoin College is sitting on traditional Wabanaki land. Now, Andrew has given you a nice overview of what's happening in the Alaska region, and I'm going to shift you over to the Canadian Arctic. But first, I want to make a brief comment about the Northwest Passage. And then what I'm going to do is discuss two case studies of Inuit responses to environmental and cultural challenges that they face. So if you look at this map, it's a very similar in content to the map that Andrew showed you. And what I want to focus on is that green line, which is the Northwest Passage. Now, Canada asserts its sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, while the United States and other countries consider it an international waterway as it connects to oceans. Canada's position is particularly important to Inuit because in terms of the land claims negotiations with them, the Canadian government agreed to defend Inuit subsistence and homeland interests in this region. Also, I'd like to point out that the Inuit are assuming a huge amount of risk and so far are seeing little benefit in the increase in vessel traffic through this region. There's a lack of search and rescue support with Inuit on the front lines. And if there should be any kind of oil spill, this would devastate the marine environment on which they depend. Now, Andrew spoke about both the diminishing of the ice and the thinning of the ice in the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean used to be full of old, thick ice that hung around that basin year after year. And when Robert Peary in 1905-06 and then in 1908-09 was traversing the Arctic Ocean in efforts to be the first person to reach the North Pole, what he was covering, what he was traveling on was really thick, old ice, in some cases quite jumbled. And this is a hand-tinted lantern slide taken on one of his expeditions. You could not replicate his expedition today, given the quality of the ice. The ice is newer, thinner, and is more easily broken up in storms, as Andrew pointed out. Now, moving out of the Arctic Ocean to the shore coastal landscapes, for humans, frozen bays and fjords and waterways around islands are vital highways. People move between settlements out to their cabins, and they use the fast ice as platforms on which to hunt. This photograph, I took it 2 years ago when Jenny and I were in Labrador, and we were standing in the middle of a bay off the community of Hopedale in the midsection of Labrador. And if you look at the texture, you can see how heavily trafficked this fast ice is, looking at all those snowmobile tracks. Now, elders traditionally have communicated information on safe passages along these frozen waterways to younger hunters and travelers. And they've also pointed out areas of perennially open water, which are usually good hunting spots. So here I've circled this dark spot in this otherwise frozen waterscape. And that's an area of perennially open water, and seals and birds would congregate there, so people would go hunt there. However, the problem is that with the warming temperatures and changes in current activities, elders no longer understand the local ice condition. And as a result, people and equipment have been falling through the ice and people have been losing their lives. In Nunatsiavut, back in 2010, 1 in 10 people had fallen through the ice, and 75% of the adult population, when interviewed, were concerned about the veracity of their ice knowledge. And things have gotten worse since then. So to address this problem, but because Inuit want to continue their traditional winter and spring hunting and traveling activities, Trevor Bell, a geologist at Memorial University, teamed up with the Nunatsiavut government, which is the Inuit government of Labrador. And they devised a program of installing sensors into that fast ice throughout the region. The combination of the fast ice, traditional knowledge held by the elders, and satellite communications has resulted in a program providing the hunters real-time information about icescapes on which it is safe to travel. The instrumentation is being built by young Inuit in the community of Nain, Labrador, providing them employment, and this is a wonderful capacity building opportunity. So here you have an example of local people taking ownership over a monitoring system as they integrate oral history, traditional knowledge, and modern instrumentation into their lives as they respond to climate change. The program has now spread to other Inuit communities and is an example of Inuit resilience and adaptability. The other topic I wanted to discuss with you is food security in the Arctic, something that Andrew mentioned, but actually it's the lack of food security that I want to talk about. Ironically, we've come to understand that animals in the Canadian Arctic carry very heavy loads of persistent organic pollutants, such as PCBs and mercury, stored particularly in their fats. These persistent organic pollutants are deposited in the Arctic through currents and winds that bring them from southern regions. Marine mammals such as this ringed seal have very, very high levels of persistent organic pollutants in their systems, as do polar bears who feed on seals and human beings who feed on seals. Now, the ringed seal is an amazing food. It is full of vital nutrients in addition to being culturally desirable and economically important to Inuit. If Inuit are not going to eat their subsistence, or in Labrador, they talk about their country foods, the alternative is industrial produced foods that have to be flown into communities and are hugely expensive, less nutritious, not as tasty, and not culturally appropriate as our country foods. Inuit have made a conscious decision to continue eating country foods, figuring that the nutrition, the access, the cultural traditions outweigh the dangers. But as Sheila Watt-Cloutier, a noted Inuit leader, has commented, what a horrible decision for a group of people to have to make. But to hunt in the contemporary Arctic, a family needs access to money. And here I'm talking about an extended family. Someone in an extended family needs access to money with which to buy equipment such as outboard motors, snow machines, supplies such as fuel and ammunition. But there are few jobs in the region. Now, one source of money has been selling sealskins. However, due to a long history of animal rights groups with anti-sealing campaigns, starting with Brigitte Bardot way back in the 1960s, Paul McCartney and his then wife, and most recently, Ellen DeGeneres, who donated money from her famous Arctic tweet to animal rights groups with prominent anti-sealing campaigns. selling these sealskins is becoming increasingly difficult. The ability to sell sealskins and products such as these fashioned from them has been hampered. The EU has made it quite difficult to import sealskin products into EU countries, a result of the anti-sealing movement. And also, social media platforms such as Facebook frequently take down posts that Canadian Inuits put up when they announce that they are selling sealskin products. Inuit have responded in some subtle but pointed ways. They pointed out that seals are not endangered, they're hunted sustainably, and the money secured from sales of sealskin materials is vital so people can feed their families. They have also noted the cultural prejudice involved, pointing out the deplorable conditions of domesticated animal factory farms in places like the United States and Canada. And I love this. This is a play on Save the Seal. It's Save the Baby Veal. They've also spoken out in some uncharacteristic and new ways, including the production of the film Angry Inuk, which you can watch on various streaming services, and I highly recommend you do, as it provides a full Inuit perspective on how they see that people from another world are undermining the food security of their children and their families. This then is just a snapshot of ways Inuit are dealing with increasing rapid environmental change and the challenges of environmental and social justice issues and globalization. They are using whatever tools they can muster to adapt and retain their culture. On the local, regional, and international levels, they are involved in a delicate and challenging balancing act. Thank you. And now I'll turn things over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was great. Susan and Andrew, tough acts to follow, but I'm very glad to be with you here today. Also coming to you from Hubbard Hall, but a few floors down from where Susan is. And I'm going to turn our attention a little bit to the east, although I suppose since we're circumpolar here, it could be to the west as well. We're going to take a look at Russia, and we're going to pick up on some of the themes that we've already discussed about Indigenous peoples, extraction, shipping, and sustainability. So I want to start by thinking a little bit about the centrality of the Arctic or the North to the Russian identity and to Russia's contemporary vision of itself as a strong and powerful state that has a global influence. I think for most Americans, it's easy for us on a day-to-day basis to forget that we're actually an Arctic power. It's not the first thing that comes to mind, but it's absolutely central to Russia's vision of itself now and moving forward. And it's captured in this kind of saying that you'll hear when you travel around the Russian Arctic: half of the Arctic belongs to Russia and half of Russia is Arctic. Now, in both cases, that isn't quite true. It's a slight exaggeration, but still it does capture Russia's strategic interest in the region. And one element of this strategic interest is, of course, rapidly expanding oil and gas extraction. We've heard about how the climate is changing, the ice is receding, previously inaccessible territories are becoming accessible, and Russia is at the forefront of extraction. However, many of the sites of oil and gas extraction in the Arctic overlap with the traditional territories of the indigenous peoples of the Russian Arctic, and that creates a variety of challenges. So what I want to do today is tell you a little bit about a project that I've been involved with two Russian co-authors, and I want to give them full credit. It's Maria Tisachnyuk and Svetlana Tulayeva. We have been working on a project since 2011, looking at how local communities grapple with oil and gas extraction in close proximity to their towns and villages in the Russian Arctic. And we've actually looked at 4 regions: Sakhalin, Komi, Yamal, and the Nenets Autonomous Okrug. And today I want to talk a little bit about the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, which is the traditional homeland of the Nenets people and some of the Komi people who are reindeer herders. And they have a kind of nomadic migratory route that they follow as their reindeer kind of go north, fattening themselves up, and then return home and are eventually harvested or slaughtered. So this is our project, Extraction and Equity, Indigenous Peoples in the Oil and Gas Industry in the Russian Arctic. So this is a map of the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, and if you look on the left-hand side in the upper part, that little shadowed area in that small box is where it's located. It's in the northwest region of Russia, somewhat proximate to Norway, not immediately adjacent to Norway. And it has experienced, since the late 1990s, an enormous explosion in the number of sites of oil and gas extraction. And that extraction is overseen by Russian companies, some names you might know, Rosneft, Lukoil, Gazprom, but also a number of Western companies. So at various times, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Shell, Total, Statoil, which is now Equinor, and also the Vietnamese and Chinese national oil companies have been involved in consortia in the region. And now oil and gas account for about 95% of the industrial activity in the region. And that's a real challenge for the remaining 2,000 to 3,000 reindeer herders who are accustomed to using that territory. And you can imagine that the coexistence of the oil and gas industry and reindeer herding is incredibly challenging. And it's challenging for a variety of reasons. It's challenging in part because the tundra is a relatively delicate ecosystem. You have moss, lichen, low bushes that take decades to grow and to recover once an industrial site is built. And so there's a great disturbance. There's also air pollution, water pollution, waste issues that have not been addressed in the Russian Arctic. But probably most challenging for reindeer herders is the construction of pipelines. There has not been a joint effort to construct shared pipelines in the Nenets Autonomous Okrug. And so each consortia has constructed its own set of pipelines. And these obviously traverse kilometers, and they have raised sections where people and reindeer can pass under. But unfortunately, these raised sections are not aligned with each other. So you might have to go several kilometers to the south and then several kilometers to the north in order to find where these sections are. So we have this kind of real disruption, and a disruption that affects cultural survival, it affects food production, it affects the socioeconomic well-being of these communities. Now, what's interesting is you might imagine that there would be some kind of Indigenous rights movement or some kind of mobilization or organizing. And there have been instances where Indigenous communities have come together to make demands and to protest the emphasis on industry in their region. However, what's more common is a discussion of what is called fair and equitable benefit sharing. And here, I'll pull this a little bit to the side so you can see it a little bit better. So what is benefit sharing? Benefit sharing is the idea that corporations that extract resources on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, whether those are pharmaceutical ingredients from the Amazon or oil and gas in the Arctic, they should be required to share some of the benefits or the revenue of that activity with people living on the territory who are proximate to the sites of extraction. And so instead of the conversation about rights, we really in Russia have a conversation about benefits. And the Russian government is very eager to press these companies to actually not only pay tax revenue, but also provide other funding to support infrastructure in the region and programming in the region. But But actually what's happened in recent years is that Indigenous peoples themselves were cut out of that process. So you'd have closed door meetings between representatives of the oil and gas company, the regional governor, possibly a mayor, and they would determine the needs of the people without actually consulting the people. So we have a picture here on the left of one of my research sites. It's the village of Waterway in the Nenets Autonomous Okrug. And there's this beautiful yellow and red building you can see in the midst of all these wooden structures. And that is a school that was built by ConocoPhillips. They imported it in, it was modular. They sort of snapped it together and they built a foundation and boom, there was a school, and then they left. And of course, the villagers are tremendously proud of this school. It is a real asset to the community, but it was constructed without consulting them, without any budget for upkeep or maintenance, without any programming budget for the activities that happen inside the school. Similarly, here on the right is a picture of the Arctica Cultural Center, an ethnological museum in the capital city of Naryan-Mar of the Nenets Autonomous Okrug. And there are lots of these sort of gleaming buildings that the governor has negotiated. There's an ice hockey arena, there's a brand new Orthodox church. But once again, people were cut out of that process. And so it's very interesting to see the kind of Indigenous advocacy that's been going on. And I want to highlight the work of one organization from the Nenets Autonomous Okrug that's called Yassaveh. And Yassaveh has been around advocating for Indigenous peoples and reindeer herders since the late 1990s. And their model or their demand is really to move from this idea of charity, of gift giving, of bestowing, even really actually quite high quality bits of infrastructure to communities, to actually think about financial compensation for these communities, because that gives the communities the choice of what to do with the funding. And they have been somewhat successful in this region, in fact, more successful than in other regions, of switching from gift giving or infrastructure building to financial compensation. And reindeer herders have been able to decide what they need. Do they need satellite phones? Do they need snowmobiles? Do they want to build reindeer processing facilities? Do they want to build storage for the meat and the hides and other things that they're hoping to take to market? Or do they want to develop it, invest in their communities in other ways? So this is a really kind of inspiring way, even in a kind of undemocratic system where Indigenous people's rights are highly constrained, of actually self-advocacy and a real benefit. Now, I have to say, it's not all happiness and rainbows. In fact, Yassaveh has a youth wing that has been declared a foreign agent, and the NGO has been reprimanded and has actually grown quite quiet in recent years and is careful not to overstep and to work constructively with the regional governor. And this is emblematic of a challenge across the Russian Arctic that Russia has a permanent participant representative to the Arctic Council, an organization that represents Indigenous peoples of the Arctic from Russia. It's called RIPON. And in recent years, too, this went from being quite an independent organization, quite active, quite dynamic, to being an organization where pro-government figures have been appointed to the leadership roles, and it's much more likely to echo the government's preferences. And so it is still a very challenging place to work. But I didn't want to, leave behind without pulling the lens back and taking a slightly broader view as well. And Andrew had already mentioned this, and Susan as well, that one of the great assets for Russia in the Arctic, let me go back up, in addition to oil and gas deposits, which oil and gas is 60% of the Russian economy, or Russia's export economy, by value. It's incredibly important for the Russian budget. But a growing area where Russia might also find kind of a lucrative revenue stream is the Northern Sea route. And the Northern Sea route, you can see here in this globe, is in red. It's an alternative. It's 40% shorter than this yellow route that goes through the Straits of Malacca, and it could bring goods from China to Europe and back again much more quickly. Now, it's not as much cheaper as you might expect. You need different kinds of ships, you need different kinds of fuel, there are different kinds of risks. There are parts of the year where it still would be quite treacherous. You need to be accompanied by an icebreaker in many cases. But still, Russia's building ports, Russia's building weather stations, refueling points, and generally investing in the infrastructure in this region. And one of the reasons that the Northern Sea route is likely to be so valuable is because it's going to be a way to export Russia's liquefied natural gas. Russia sells a lot of gas to Europe, but the Chinese market for Russian gas is growing, and Chinese investment, ever since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, Western companies have been restricted from working with Russian companies in some ways, and China has really filled the gap. And so on the bottom left is a picture of the Yamal liquefied natural gas terminal on the Yamal Peninsula, and that has been funded to significant degree by the Chinese National Petroleum Company. And so we see these ties coming together. Now, is this a long-term strategy? It's hard to say, right? Europe has promised to decarbonize its economy. Even China is thinking more about renewables. And it's interesting that the Russian government seems to recognize this. The deputy energy minister said last year that Russia has a 2-decade window of opportunity to extract as much oil and gas as possible before the global economy potentially shifts more toward renewables, biofuels, hydrogen, and things like that. And in order to make this happen, there is going to be an $85 billion investment in the Russian Arctic in the next couple of years. Now, I put up this cartoon as a joke, plans after Crimea. You remember in 2014, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine and annexed the Ukrainian territory of Crimea. And then here's a conversation about Alaska. Often when we talk about Russia and the Arctic, people have a lot of questions about conflict, about militarization of the Arctic. There are certain trends that do present a challenge. At the same time, so far, Russia has remained deeply engaged in all of the global governance institutions that have to do with the Arctic, including the Arctic Council and the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. And so I think that predictions of conflict in the Arctic tend to be overblown. There are lots of avenues for cooperation as well, but we actually have to seize them. Cooperation won't happen by default. It's something that we need to make happen. All right, I'm going to leave it at that so you guys have time for Q&A, but thank you so much for being here, and I'll invite my colleagues to join me. Here we go. And Jenny can lead us in the Q&A.
Right, so yes, to all our viewers and listeners, you please feel free to add questions to the Q&A, and we'll sort through them and ask them of the presenters. I want to start off, since I'm the one with the who can start off, asking, because all three of you touched on shipping and the Northern Sea route and the Northwest Passage. And Andrew, you had talked about the Central Arctic Ocean route that, you know, eventually one day it might be possible to go right over the North Pole, and you talked about that you are starting to look at managing that in some way. And I'm curious about that, since it's international water. I don't know much about shipping, but.
Right. Yeah. Those polar waters in the high seas are beyond jurisdiction of any one nation. So it's impossible, for instance, for the U.S. to just kind of unilaterally declare a shipping management regime. But we can go to the International Maritime Organization and work in concert, ideally with all the other Arctic nations, and say, you know, here's what we know about this area. Here's where important, you know, ecological resources are. Here are, you know, areas of old ice that we really don't want to disturb, and we can design shipping routes to try and limit impact or limit the areas where vessels can go. So it's not just a free-for-all. Or on the other side of the coin, you could identify important areas that you want to protect and have those be areas to be avoided is the technical term, but basically no-go zones for big commercial vessels, and manage it that way. But this is another place, like Professor Henry was just saying, where to date there has been a lot of really productive and positive cooperation, even in between the US and Russia, where that's not always the case.
Thank you. And so this is could be for any of you or for all of you. a question from David Conover regarding Maine and the Eastern Arctic, and how do you imagine future engagement? I know Maine, of course, has positioned itself as an Arctic state in some ways. So who wants to take that one?
I'll take a first stab at it. Yes, I think perhaps Andrew, correct me, but I think the Alaskans shuffle a little uncomfortably as Senator King declares that Maine is another Arctic nation. But if any of you have been to Portland, you've seen that Portland, Maine has developed its infrastructure, port infrastructure. Eimskip, which is a major Icelandic shipping company, has moved its headquarters from one of the Carolinas to Portland, Maine. So there is a concerted effort to develop increased commercial and cultural connections between Maine and the Nordic countries. There are also ongoing discussions and trade relations between Maine and Canada. And really, if you start looking environmentally at the North Atlantic, you can see that really the developments in the North Atlantic, they come down and they affect Maine. So there are those economic, environmental ties. And I would just point out as an archaeologist that back 5,000 years, there were obviously trade relations, because there is some material called Ramachurt that is found only in Labrador, northern Labrador, that was traded down. And some of you know the red paint people, or the maritime archaic, who lived in Maine. Well, they used that material, which was traded from Labrador. So the connections have been ongoing for thousands of years.
The only thing I would add to that is just, I think, the most compelling thing that I've heard probably was when Janet Mills spoke, I think at the Arctic Circle meeting several years ago, and talked about Maine's communities and coastal communities in particular having similar challenges to other coastal communities in the North Atlantic and the Arctic, challenges that had to do with fish stocks and, lobster and shellfish and just natural resource dependence in general. And, having this shared problem that Maine perhaps could be part of thinking about shared solutions as well. And so I think in some ways it's almost humorous to see the Maine representation in DC proclaim themselves Arctic, but in other cases, it really does seem like there's a kind of constructive aspect to it.
Well, thank you. Moving on to other subjects, Caroline Poole, and this again, I think all of you can address because you've all talked about this. She asks, Indigenous environmental wisdom and scientific understanding often seem to function separately. So what tools do grassroots organizations, conservancies, and policymakers in Arctic regions use to bridge the divide? And it's a big question, but I don't know, Laura, do you want to start, or since,
in Russia, there's so little effort to bridge the divide. I feel like we should hear from people who actually see this kind of happening.
Yeah, I know for a lot of Indigenous groups in Alaska, the solution is seen as co-production of knowledge, where you have Indigenous knowledge holders and Western scientists coming together at the very outset of a proposed project, even defining what the project is with input from the Indigenous knowledge holders, and then weaving those two strands together throughout the process. So it really becomes an integration right from the start. And it's not that Indigenous knowledge is kind of awkwardly bolted on at the end, but it's really a process of developing those things together. So I think that's definitely been the trend here in Alaska.
And I think it's the trend in Canada as well of really trying to integrate rather than, I think early on it was try to reconcile. And now it's more partnerships, as Andrew said, ideally from the beginning and definition of a project and collaborations. And many of the Inuit self-government organizations, they have environmental arms to them. And they are in ready contact. They use Western science, but they combine it with traditional knowledge.
Yeah, and I think the Smart Ice program that you talked about, Susan, is a great example of that, where it really, better than almost any other project I know of, combines those two. And it's something, it's definitely worth looking more into that if it's a question that interests you. And is why they got the Arctic Inspirations Prize, which is $1 million prize offered by a Canadian charity. So Sabrina Becker has asked, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we're all facing difficulties in different ways, and many people are brought to the edge of their existence. Are Indigenous peoples in the Arctic particularly affected by the pandemic? I know that's a big question. Susan, do you want to start with that, since there's such good examples in Canada?
Yeah, well, in Labrador, where I work, there's good documentation. In fact, a book has just been published on the 1918 flu epidemic. And the Moravian missionaries who serviced Labrador starting in the 1700s, they lingered in St. John's, Newfoundland for a while because they knew they had some people with the 1918 flu on board. And then when they thought it was safe to travel, they traveled up the coast, and they ended up infecting all the communities up the coast until they got to Okok, which was the largest community. And people from all the countryside would come because they knew that the Moravian vessel was coming once a year. And the vessel stayed there for a few days. Some people started to fall sick, but they went one community north until someone pulled them back. And in the community of Okok, almost everybody died. They were so susceptible to this flu. So when the coronavirus hit, most communities I know in the Canadian Arctic and Greenland, I don't know about Alaska, they shut down. No one was allowed in or out. And they have, in most, but not all cases, they have been successful. And the Canadian government has also been very proactive in getting, for instance, people in Labrador vaccinated very early, but those travel restrictions continue.
I would just say about the Russian Arctic, briefly in response to the coronavirus, there's been so little testing that it's hard to really understand how the pandemic is affecting people. But one of the challenges in the Russian Arctic is that the Soviet state heavily subsidized these far-flung communities that it saw as part of its kind of planned economy. And when the regime collapsed in 1991, all the things that the state had been supporting, the clinics, the daycare centers, the community centers and things like that, lost their funding. And the reverberations of that are still very profound. So it's very challenging to get healthcare outside of a few of the major cities in the Russian Arctic. So if you get sick, it really is quite a dire situation.
We're almost out of time. Andrew, do you want to quickly address the situation in Alaska?
Yeah, it sounds very similar to what Susan described. I'll just say that Alaska Native organizations have done a fantastic job of distributing the vaccine. In fact, I was able to get my shot through an Alaska Native nonprofit because they had done such a good job of distributing the vaccine to their own populations. Now they're starting to, expand and make it available to anyone. So I'm personally very grateful for their competence in doing that.
Yeah, it's been very interesting, and of course, all of us do research in these small communities in the North, and I know nobody I know who's does research in the North is going north. We didn't go last summer. We're not going this summer or fall or whatever. It's just keeping those communities safe. So hopefully things will change soon, but for now, it's still a problem. We are just past 5 o'clock, and so it's time to wrap things up. There's still questions, and we can maybe try and address them through email or something like that. I hope there's questions about polar bears, of course. But for now, I just would like to thank you all and to thank our viewers and listeners for attending this webinar, and thank Sarah for doing such a great job of organizing it, and wish you all a good afternoon.